welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by a local luminary, a graduate of Syosset High School, and somebody who has worked in a field that I was once in before I came to this library. I am what I like to call a recovering medievalist, and we are here to talk to an active medievalist, and I'm so excited to talk about his work and his book, so let's hop right into it. Welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Sure, I'd be happy to. First, thanks for having me, Jen. It's fun to be, at least by proxy, back at the Syosset Public Library, where I spent a lot of time as a kid and genuinely learned to love reading in a way that led to a PhD and a lifetime of writing books, which was inconceivable when I was a kid and hated to read. So thank you to the Syosset Public Library and its science fiction and fantasy section, which I'm sure is no great surprise leads one to be a medievalist. So, my name is Asa Mittman. I am a professor of art history at California State University, Chico, which is in far northern California. And I have been there for over a decade and a half now. My research generally focuses on two main subjects: the history of cartography, that is to say, medieval maps. I work on the oldest European maps of the world generally, and on monsters, which of course have a lot to do with maps. There is literally only a single map from the Middle Ages that says on it, "Here there be monsters." But there is one, and then there are lots of maps from the Middle Ages that have all kinds of other things about monsters on them. So that is what I've been working on for the last 25 years or so since graduate school.
Nice. Welcome. It's so nice to have you. And before we get into your research and your writing, I'd love to talk a little bit about, your time here. You mentioned your love of the library, which thank you very much. That's lovely to hear. And I also love to patronize the sci-fi section. It's one of my favorites. So I'm just curious about when it was that you became interested in the Middle Ages. Did it happen while you were still here in Syosset, or had you gone to college already? What's the timeline?
Well, if we're going back into ancient history, first off, I should say, so I'm dyslexic. I was diagnosed as a kid, and that made reading. And I was fortunate enough to get an early diagnosis and then some, kind of occupational therapy I have very dim memories of because I was like 6. But it did seem to have a substantially helpful effect. But I really hated reading. It was difficult, and most other pursuits weren't that difficult for me as a kid. And my mother made a deal with me because when I was a kid, Nintendo came out, and that was the coolest thing that had ever happened, right? And she said she'd buy it for me, but only if I read 30 books over the course of a summer. I think it was the summer before I was going into middle school, H.B. Thompson Middle School. And so I, with no hope that I could accomplish this task, trudged over to the Syosset Public Library. I grew up in the neighborhood just next door to it and trudged around, desperate to find anything that didn't look awful, and stumbled on sci-fi and fantasy. And I mean, my mother is a very smart person, and her scheme worked absolutely because, of course, I finished the books, I got the Nintendo, but I never stopped reading. And I should note, she is also a published novelist, Stephanie Mittman, who also publishes as Stevie Mittman. She hasn't published a book in a while, but she's actually just getting back into writing now after a hiatus. So another Syosset author. So in terms of how I got into medieval, well, I mean, if you're reading Dragonlance novels at the back of the bus when you're 14, you're already kind of halfway there, right? And I read a lot of Tolkien as a kid and loved that. And when I went off to college, I took a range of courses. I tried to declare my art history major first semester freshman year, and they explained that wasn't possible, and I kept insisting until they let me. But I took 4 art history classes my first semester. I was really into it straight from the start, and I've never looked back. It's the thing I would like to keep doing indefinitely. But I took a bunch of different courses and different materials thinking that, of course, everybody loves the Renaissance. That'll be great. No, the Renaissance is really dull. All the cool stuff is medieval. And I also very much enjoyed the classes by the main medievalist who was there. I was at Cornell as an undergrad. And that was a guy named Bob Calkins, who was very scowly and growly and a deeply sweet person once you got to know him, and had a very dry sense of humor. So me and my Syosset High old friend all the way back to kindergarten, Christine Shaka, who I took AP Art History with, Fran Bissell in Syosset High. She also majored in art history, also at Cornell. And so she and I would sit next to each other in Bob Calkins' classes, laughing our asses off. Pardon me, I don't know if I can say that on this. Laughing our heads off. And nobody else in the class seemed to have any idea that he was telling jokes the whole time. So we had a blast, and he was great, and I was falling in love with the material. And actually, I had an amazing opportunity. He took me as a kind of TA on they do these NEH summer seminars for primary and secondary school teachers, where they can go abroad. I don't know what the status of those under the radical scaling back of federal grants, but that's what that program was, and it was there for decades. And he took me as a TA to Paris with a group of American high school teachers. And so I got to go around all the churches and cathedrals and some of the places outside of Paris. And it was a very meaningful and at times a very moving experience. So I've spent more or less all the time since just coming up with schemes to get myself to travel around Europe and look at incredible objects. And I should say I work on manuscripts, so handmade books. They're written on animal skin, sometimes called vellum or parchment. They're handwritten with bird feather quill pens. The ink is made out of mostly burned up oak galls and some various other things. And they're painted with a variety of materials and sometimes literally illuminated. We call them illuminated manuscripts. The illuminated part is if they actually have gold in them, because then they shine as if they themselves are a light source. So I work on, these 1,000-year-old, 700-year-old, 500-year-old handmade books. And one of the great things about working on manuscripts is you actually get to handle them. If you are the world's expert in a painter who paints on panel or canvas, the painting hangs on the wall and you put your hands behind your back and you look at it. You think more things probably than the person standing next to you in the museum. You have more background, you may understand more, you may see more richly and more deeply because you have more background in it, more knowledge, but you still just stand there. But with manuscripts, they open up sometimes, the vaults, the cases, they go into the back stacks of the library collections and they pull these things out and they hand them to you. My grubby mitts have held Beowulf, the only copy of, this thing that's often treated like, the sort of wellspring of English literature, oldest surviving epic poem in the language we are currently speaking, though not in a form that's particularly recognizable today. But yes, so I've loved working on the Middle Ages since before I knew that I could make a living doing this. If you had told me when I was 12, you can make a living being a professor of medieval monsters, I would have been all in, but I don't know that I would have believed you that that was a career path. But here I am to prove it. It is, in fact, one.
That's an amazing story. And oh my gosh, to hold those manuscripts, that's not something that I ever got to do in my coursework because a large portion of it was done during a pandemic. But it was really just seems like a really lovely thing to do. I'd love if you could talk a little bit more about, your research interests. You've talked about manuscripts, maps, monsters. I'd love to talk about how those things all come together in your newest book project. I'm going to lead with a big question, which I hope you don't mind, but I'm curious, what do maps tell us about a people or a place besides where things are? Or, they might not even do that. So,
well, the short answer to that is they tell us everything. So scholars in the humanities spend a great deal of time and effort and intellectual prowess studying all kinds of documents in order to learn about the worldviews of the people they study. So they might look at poetry or painting or the stuff of everyday life, utensils used in the kitchen, whatever. They look at all the kinds of artifactual remnants, clothing, houses, buildings, churches, temples, everything. They look at everything they can to try and divine the worldviews of the people who made them, right? But the thing is, some peoples actually draw their worldviews. Literally, they make pictures of their view of the world. That's what a map is. So we tend to think as modern people that maps are first and foremost about navigation. They get me from here to there, right? But the vast majority of maps that you encounter in your life don't do that. So the first maps most kids encounter are in picture books where it shows that there are like elephants here and pandas there, right? It's not to help them like go on a trip, right? It's to establish where these things are, often in relationship to where they are, which is usually very, very far away. The other place they encounter them is on the walls of their classrooms, right? And again, you're not supposed to look as a kindergartner and be like, oh, okay, that's how I get to Madagascar. All right, well, what's happening after lunch, right? You are learning about the world and its organization and your emplacement within that. Um, and so on and so forth, all the way up. And when we talked about sci-fi and fantasy, how many fantasy novels do you open and the first thing you see is a map of the artificial world, which is an important part of world building. It's a way of establishing this world, but that's what maps do with this world too, because they don't show anything like a literal truth of the world. They show, as cartographic theorist Dennis Wood writes, he says, not the world, but a slice of a piece of the world, not as it is, but a slant on it through a glass darkly, and so on. He writes very eloquent prose, but so what we're seeing is the world view rather than the world itself. And so monsters, right? What are they doing there? Well, one of the main things that, well, humans do, but one of the main things that maps are important in establishing is the identity of the culture that creates them and consumes them through contrast with other cultures, other places, other peoples, other beings. Um, some scholars have described this as dependent differentiation, which is to say, I know what I am because I know what I'm not. I mean, another way to think of this is, I mean, ultimately one of the most pernicious forces in human history, a kind of us and them worldview, a tribalism, a way of determining in-groups and out-groups, and that is very much the story of cartography, which is to say, we, the good and decent and right people, are over here. Over there, they live, and they might be strange peoples, monstrous creatures, dangerous armies, fearsome environments. But with those dangers almost always comes an allure as well. So this is the land where there are dragons and giant gems. And so there is always a kind of pull to go to those places and risk the dangers for some kind of benefit, And so these processes of identity through exclusions, through the generation of otherness, through the creation of sometimes wholly fictional, but sometimes real, extant, living human beings and other creatures as some kind of existential other or existential threat. That process is the thing I've been working on in various ways, in various forms since graduate school, basically. So what is the story, at least for me, primarily I work on mostly England. What is the story that medieval English Christians, who were the dominant culture, were telling about themselves through and across the existence of other kinds of people? And that's what got me to the present project. So my first book was called Maps and Monsters in Medieval England. Then that came out of my dissertation. Then I wrote a book on monsters, and then I wrote a book on maps. But I returned and eventually wrote this thing called Cartographies of Exclusion, Anti-Semitic Mapping in Medieval England. And sort of my joke to myself was, I'm just rewriting my first book, which is to say, it is again Maps and Monsters in Medieval England because the Middle Ages, and particularly England, is heavily responsible for the anti-Semitic tropes that would become very widely known to the modern world via the Nazis, but endure into the present day. I mean, I could go over them, all kinds of horrible things that have been claimed libelously against Jewish people, Jewish individuals, Jewish cultures, Jewish religious practice, Jewish texts, Jewish bodies, Jewish dispositions, all of those tropes. Well, should I say all? I think all of them are probably present. I mean, even things like a global conspiracy to pull the strings to take over the entire world, that's in Matthew Paris's 13th century Chronicle of English History. So these things are deeply rooted, very deeply rooted. And so that book was supposed to be a chapter in my dissertation, and I never wrote it. And then it was supposed to be a chapter in my first book. I never wrote it. And then I finally decided to pick it up, and it took 15 years to write. Um, and so that is this book. And actually, just over the last month, I have boiled that all down to a single chapter, which is going to be part of the revised 20th anniversary second edition of my first book. So the chapter that was supposed to be there will be there, and now it exists. But it took me 15 years and a lot of work to bring it into existence.
So I am interested in that 15 years because I think that's something that might be interesting to our listeners is, when I interview the authors of novels, and this isn't always true at all, but oftentimes the story is, something like, yeah, I had this idea 18 months ago and now there's a book and here it is. And that's not really quite how it works in academic writing. So can you talk a little bit about maybe the process of researching and writing a book that is trying to undertake something that is both so huge in scope and also incredibly detailed and doing very close reading of sources?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think I've read that Ray Bradbury wrote Fahrenheit 451 in something like 4.5 hours on a quarter taking pay by the minute typewriter in the basement of, I think, UCLA. So yeah, sometimes a great work of fiction can come into existence very quickly. It's hard for an academic book to do that. Um, so. This one took me much longer to write than anything else I've written. I mean, 5 times as long as anything else I've written, um, for a number of reasons. First off, I had maybe, I don't know. I love medieval art. I love these maps. I'm fascinated by the culture. And it has this horrible thing that is very much at the core of it, which is a deep, profound, definitional anti-Semitism, which can be traced back to the early Christian period, which it's present even in the writings of, say, St. Paul. So a bunch of the early Christians were converted Jews, and they defined their Christianity very much against the identity that they were abandoning, that they were leaving behind. And so Judaism was to them, or Jewishness was to them, a vital point of contrast. Okay, but then once Christianity began to be primarily composed of people converted out of polytheist groups rather than Jews, the relationship, so the rhetoric that positioned Judaism as the sort of oppositional force to Christianity is maintained, but there's no like personal connection to it. And so the kind of demonization of Judaism begins to ratchet upward. And in the period that I work on, the Middle Ages, this is when the majority of the anti-Semitic tropes are generated, and a good number of them actually are generated in England. I know, people tend to think Germany is the source of all this stuff because of the Nazis, but first off, the Nazis weren't only in Germany, and second, these tropes that they used were widely prevalent, and yeah, a lot of them were, it seems, developed in England, which had a very particular an unusual situation in regard to its Jewish population, which is to say, Europe had Jewish populations, for centuries, but England didn't. There is no record of any settled Jewish population before the Norman conquest in 1066. And William the Conqueror conquers England, and then he imports a community of Jews who were wealthy money lenders. He brought them in expressly to lend money so that he could then build a bunch of castles, build a bunch of cathedrals, and subdue the English population. And so this community was new to England, was brought in by the person who had conquered the local population, was at least parts of it fabulously wealthy, and then was deployed by the English crown in all kinds of ways, including as tax collectors. You know how much everybody likes when the tax man shows up. Um, and so, through a variety of legal regulations created by kings and religious regulations created by the English church and by the papacy in Rome, there was kind of an enforced gap, an enforced separation. They very much did not want Christians to mingle with Jews because, of course, if you do that, you learn that Jews are just, human beings just like everybody else. And so they very, very actively resisted that. And there was a couple of sort of explosive episodes where we can see the sort of rage and fury about this, including, for example, a wedding by the son of a very prominent figure in the Jewish community in a town called Hereford. He threw a big wedding. He invited all the important people in town, and the local bishop absolutely lost his mind about this. There's a whole transcript of it. He broke down sobbing in tears. He threatened to quit his job if they didn't, fix this horrible problem. And he gets what he wants, much more enforced separation as a result. But what he's upset about is, a guy threw a party for his son and his new daughter-in-law, and he invited his neighbors. I mean, that's actually the most dangerous thing that was happening. So all the things that people said Jews were doing, they of course were not. They were not kidnapping Christian babies and crucifying them and using their blood to make Passover matzah. That wasn't happening. What was happening was normal, decent, friendly people were hanging out and having a good time and breaking bread and sharing wine. And that was the real danger, which was to say the losing of this oppositional other that English Christians were very much defining themselves against. So they wanted to make sure that did not happen. And there were huge outbreaks of violence, mass murders, hangings, burnings alive of entire communities of hundreds of people all at once, men, women, children, the whole thing. So that is to say, a lot of this stuff, first off, I had to learn all that stuff that I had kind of actively avoided looking at. Second, though, it was all emotionally gutting. So, every article you read ends the same way. Whatever the circumstances, then like the last line is, oh, and then they killed them all. And, so it was kind of, I know the word trauma gets thrown around far too much, but it was kind of traumatizing to read article after article after article that kept ending with these horrors. The mechanisms and the modes and the visual and verbal rhetoric used for them were nefariously fascinating, but it was very difficult. I should say that town Hereford, where the wedding was, that is the place where the most important map surviving from the Middle Ages was made and for 700 years has been. That's called the Hereford map. It's in Hereford Cathedral. And it also has the most extensive and outrageous anti-Semitic content on it. And it's really the centerpiece of this book. It's the thing that's on the cover of the book. And the book really revolves around it. All the other maps that appear in the book are kind of ancillary examples that serve to illuminate really what's going on in this one sort of masterpiece of identity formation through hatred, rejection, fear, disgust, which is not necessary. We really, as humans, as individuals, as groups, do not have to define ourselves this way. We don't. But we do it over and over and over and over and over again. We are doing it in a whole lot of ways right now. So yes, why did the book take so long? How much work went into it? An enormous amount. I had to learn basically a whole new field, which was medieval Jewish history. I had to learn a whole lot about what they call Anglo-Jewish relations. So the relationship of, even that is kind of a problematic framing, right? It suggests that there's a group of the English and a group of Jews who are not English. Jewish families lived in England for 200 years. They're, they spoke the language everybody else spoke, which for a while was French, thanks to the Norman Conquest, which was a group of transplanted Scandinavians who had settled in France, started speaking French, and moved across when William the Conqueror conquered England. So they spoke French, they spoke English, as well as Hebrew. But yes, so of course there were English Jews and English Christians, right? But the way they saw it was English people and Jews. Right, so Jews were never allowed to become actually a part of England, and they're thrown out in 1290, which is the first of the mass expulsions of Jews from any European polity, region, country. And then they get successively forced out. So they flee to the continent and then get thrown out of various other places. Spain, famously in 1492, the same year that Columbus set sail, is the year that Jews were expelled and Muslims were expelled from Spain. They're thrown out of France and so make their way both to the Middle East, North Africa, and also to Eastern Europe, which presumably is how my own ancestors wound up in Eastern Europe before getting thrown out of there and fleeing, of course, to the US, as many, many Jewish families did.
It's such a fascinating history, and I think it would be easy for somebody unfamiliar with the material to think that the academic study of monsters is, sort of a quaint, sort of old-fashioned thing that to be interested in, or sort of, a fun elective that you might take if you have a couple extra credits here and there. But as you have been saying, these maps allow us to draw a direct line from that time to ours with the foundations of modern anti-Semitism and even migration patterns, as you've been saying. It has shaped the modern world in all these different ways.
Absolutely. And I should just put in a quick note here. So this book focuses on Jews on these maps, but most of the other stuff I've written has focused on groups that are framed as being the inhabitants of Africa and Asia, and their monstrous forms has an incredibly pernicious legacy. The medieval text called the Book of John Mandeville. Nobody's heard of it anymore except medievalists. It was the most popular secular text of the entire Middle Ages. Translations survive of it, not only in English and French and Italian and Spanish and German. There's a medieval Czech version. It was translated into, a tremendous variety of languages. There are 300 medieval copies of it that survive. There's one of Beowulf. There's been like 27 Beowulf movies, right? There's one copy that survived of that. There's 300 that survived the Book of John Mandeville. It tells you presumably about their relative popularity. That's the book. So it tells about this fictional English knight, John Mandeville, who went all the way to India and all the monsters that he encounters there, monstrous peoples he encounters there. That was Christopher Columbus's bedside reading on the voyage across. And remember, he was going to India. So he arrives in India, having read what he takes to be a factual account of the monstrous people there, and then he begins a massive genocide. Well, the thing is, he thought he was a hero, right? What are you supposed to do with monsters? The heroic thing to do is to kill monsters. Well, if you declare people monsters. So he gets there. He says these are the Indians. He also tells us, if you read this weird journal that survives that he kind of dictated to somebody else, kind of ghostwritten thing. But anyway, it's a primary source from the time of his voyages. He says, he directly references some of the monstrous peoples that are in Mandeville. So he says, I didn't see all of them myself, but the people I talked to told me over there and on that island, this island, on the island of Bohio, are the one-eyed dog-headed cannibals. And what he's done is he's taken one-eyed cyclopses from Mandeville and dog-headed cynocephali from Mandeville, who are sometimes also cannibals, and also just all the other cannibals that appear all over Mandeville, kind of conflated them into one mega monstrous group. So if the people who live, in what is actually, what we call the Caribbean, a term that derives from a Renaissance term that means cannibal. So the Caribbean Sea is the Sea of Cannibals. So too the Amazon is the land of the Amazons, who are a monstrous group of warrior women from these same kinds of sources. Patagonia was the land of Patagon, who was a giant from English myth. So as Europeans were conquering various parts of the Americas, they inscribed them with monstrosity from the start, which again justified to them the horrors of colonization, which included, of course, genocide, depopulation, enslavement, because they had determined prior to arrival, thanks to the tropes that were set up on medieval maps and in medieval texts like the Book of John Mandeville, had established before they arrived that these people were not human or not quite human. And so any treatment of them was already justified. They were following in the model of Alexander the Great, who fought these monsters in medieval mythology, including, they decide, he fought against Jews, but he fought against all kinds of terrible peoples and monsters and walled them up or murdered them off. And that became a kind of prototype for good kingship. And so, yeah, sorry, there's a long rant, but point being, yes, this was very important in the history of anti-Semitism, but it's also very important in the history of other forms of racism and in terms of colonialism as well. So the legacy of these medieval processes of establishing identity through exclusion are scattershot. They have harmed massive numbers of people. This is, I should also note, not like Europeans didn't invent this uniquely. We can find these processes at play all over the place. I mean, I hate to say it, but I think it's in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the oldest document of any particular length and significance that survives from all of human history. 4,000-year-old thing from the ancient Near East, Sumerian. It's written in, cuneiform on clay tablets, and it features the great god king Gilgamesh, who has to go way over there to where the monstrous guy lives. And what does he do? He kills the monster. Sorry, spoiler alert, but if you haven't read it yet, you've had 4,000 years. But he kills Humbaba, the monster, who is actually just like a person who lives in the forest over on, distant from Uruk, where Gilgamesh is from. So this is a profoundly human way of engaging with the world. It is a regrettable feature that seems incredibly common throughout human history.
And it seems like the mapping, if not the Hereford map, yes, but also mapping in general plays a really integral role in that sort of creation of an order that then creates hierarchies and different modes of relating to people. You talk
Absolutely.
about some of these ways in the book. You talk about the strategies of these maps. There was one in particular I was really interested in that I would love if you could talk a little bit more about, portraying the Jewish inhabitants of England or Europe as mislocated and time and space. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and sort of what was the intention in trying to build that image?
Sure. Yeah. So I tried to identify. So what are the various strategies? I mean, first I was just finding examples. Oh, look, here's a terrible thing said about Jews on a map. Here's an example of the demonized Jewish figure on a map. But then, I tried to, as academics do, I tried to systematize it, right? So are there a range of approaches that have been taken to deal with this subject? How are they framing it? And I identified a handful of different approaches. One of the key ones being this mislocation. So not the Hereford map, which was made very shortly after the expulsion, within, say, a decade of the expulsion, but most of the other maps that I discuss in the book were made while there were Jews in England. And they depict Jews everywhere but England, but they also, so that's mislocating in place. So where are Jews? Well, they are a perpetual outsider, a trope that endures to the present, right? So they're never truly able to be integrated, as I was saying before. They're never counted as English. They're Jews living in England, but not English, because to be English was to be Christian in the period. Christian nationalism carries on today in a variety of countries, which define the nation according to religion, even in nations that are not set up to be defined by religion. So it was very important on these maps to project Jews as way over there, not here, but often threateningly coming this way. So presented as an encroaching risk, which suggests that the English people were under a kind of threat, an invasion even, of this foreign and hostile element. That's how they're framed, but also mislocated, as you mentioned, in time. So Jews are not, it seems, allowed to be a people of the medieval present. They're presented either as sort of frozen in time, ancient relics of the ancient world, people who never moved past the moment of Christ's life. And this is shown in various accusations, like that Jews continue to try and crucify Christians. They're blamed for Jesus's crucifixion in some medieval texts, a lot of medieval texts. Jesus was arrested by Roman authorities and executed by the Roman power structure. But this is then placed on Jews. And so there are various accusations. So Christians argue that, for example, Jews would steal the Eucharist wafer, the bread used in Christian mass ceremony, that was debated from much of the Middle Ages. Was it a literal miracle? Was it some kind of symbol? The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 declares it to be a literal miracle. That is also the same church council that declares that all Jews and Muslims must wear identifying clothing to stop them from merging and mixing into the Christian population, and most importantly, having sex with Christians. That is the great fear that the Pope is worrying about here. So it's a very important church council, but those things are not separate. The Eucharist being a literal miracle and a kind of attempt to further other and outcast Jews and Muslims. So they said that Jews stole the Eucharist wafer, brought it home, and then would attack it with knives or even crucify it. In these various miracle stories, then the Eucharist bleeds. And in some cases, the blood fills the Jews' home and drowns the Jews. And this is used to show that the Eucharist really is a miraculous thing, right? Because it is Jesus' body, therefore it actually bleeds. It's not a piece of bread or a cracker, which is what it looks like. No, it's actually the body. But the fundamental argument that's being made in these anti-Semitic host desecration stories, what they're called, is that Jews know that the Eucharist really is Jesus' body, which is to say they know Jesus is the Messiah, but refuse to switch their beliefs and practices anyway, right? I mean, it doesn't make sense for Jews to steal the Eucharist and crucify it. It's a cracker, it's bread if you don't believe, right? So, of course, medieval Christians took this seriously. They believed, that's fine. Many modern people believe, that's fine. But for somebody who is not of that religion to steal it and attack it suggests that they know a truth. They believe this to be true. And yet, because of stubbornness, hard-heartedness, stone-heartedness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, these are all terms that various anti-Semitic authors throw at Jews. They refuse to change their ways. So they are locked in that moment. And this is crystallized by this figure called the Wandering Jew. I don't know if you ever heard of this trope, but there's a plant. There's a plant that's called Wandering Jew. You can go into like your local, botanical store and buy a Wandering Jew plant. If you ever see it advertised as such, please ask. It has some scientific name. Please ask them to stop calling it that. The Wandering Jew is this figure. He goes by a whole lot of different names, including Ahasuerus, but also Cartophilius, which sounds like it means guy who loves maps, but it's got a different etymology. But he is a Jew who sees Christ and attacks him on the way to the crucifixion. And this is not in the Bible, it's a later story, but Jesus then, in a rather vindictive moment, curses him to wander the earth forever telling his story. And so this single individual is actually a guy from the first century, purportedly, who is wandering the world telling the story of when he mocked Christ and the punishment he has given for it, which is a form of what they call Jewish witness. So they make a Jew stand in to tell a Christian truth. Jews are not allowed in Christian rhetoric to have their own reason for existing. They only exist to tell stories for Christians. This is something that St. Augustine, who's like the architect of Christianity as a religion, says. So this is very foundational. This is ancient stuff. This is 4th, 5th century stuff. The idea that Jews only should be allowed to live so that they can tell Christian stories for Christian purpose, not for their own right to live and exist as beings in the world. So right, you got to figure it like the Wandering Jew who is locked forever in the past. Okay, so he appears on some of these maps. So not present Jews and not English Jews, but this ancient figure who's locked there forever. Also, Jews worshiping the golden calf and other such ancient images appear. But also they are then forecast forward into the apocalyptic future, which medieval Christians were quite worried about, with all kinds of evidence that they took the idea that the apocalypse was coming, end days, Jesus would return. They took it very seriously. And there are various panics. Around the year 1000, people panic, and then the world doesn't end. and they celebrate, they're so happy, and then they think, oh no, it's 1,000 years from when Jesus is crucified, not when he's born. Big panic in 1033 because Jesus was crucified when he was 33. Again, the world doesn't end. Then there's one, at 11, 1150, 12, 1250. 1250 was a big one. One of the main map makers from the Middle Ages, Matthew Paris, he is really convinced the world's going to end at 1250. It was a kind of millennial craze that was going on at the time. The Mongol invasions of the period, they think, are the apocalyptic hordes of Gog and Magog. They also think the Mongols are Jews. Mongols were a very complicated group that was tied together more politically than religiously, and they had a lot of different groups subsumed within a kind of larger kind of military and political alliance. But anyway, so on a lot of the maps, Gog and Magog are present as this apocalyptic group that's supposed to destroy all civilization at the end times. But they'll swap out, they take out the names Gog and Magog, and they put in Jews. And so Jews become creatures of the distant past and the apocalyptic monstrous hordes of the future. So they are not here and they are not now. They are over there and back then or in the future. They're not allowed to just be your frickin' neighbors. They are an outside invading force that cannot be assimilated. I mean, they did wonder, some people said, well, we should convert them. But others said it's not even possible. That Judaism, they decide, is, they wouldn't have talked in terms of sort of genetics, of course, but is a kind of hereditary trait, a kind of biological trait that cannot be removed, that a Jew might claim to convert, but never truly could. And this gives birth to the status of the so-called conversos, which is a term that's used primarily in Spain, which is not Christians, it's converted Jews. They are conversos, the people who converted. Well, if they've converted, all Christians had to convert at some, like every Christian line that exists in the world began with a convert somewhere, right? So in essence, all Jewish peoples are converts or the descendants of converts, right? Which is true of many religions, of course. But Jews are not granted the ability in the Middle Ages to truly, any converted Jew is always going to be suspect. And we have lots of instances of converted Jews that, throughout Europe, including in England, who are treated very much differently. And denied the sort of standard rights and expectations that other people had because of their lineage, which was viewed as being kind of a permanent, as they would have thought, as medieval Christians thought, kind of stain upon them that could not be removed, even by conversion, which, if you think about it, is a kind of diminishment of the power of Christ, that he's somehow unable to rescue these people, but that's because they didn't really think Jews were people. And there are Christian exegetes who say this quite openly. Peter the Venerable is probably the most sort of outrageous of these, but he writes a whole tract, Contra Judaeos, or whatever it's called, which is against the Jews, against the inveterate obstinacy of the Jews, I think is what the tract is called in English. And he says, truly, I do not know if Jews are even people. So if they're not really people, of course, they can't really convert. And again, of course, if you demonize a group, watch always for demonizing rhetoric, for animalistic rhetoric, for dehumanizing rhetoric, because once a people has been dehumanized, then killing them ceases to be a crime, ceases to be an act of murder, becomes, in rhetoric, a reasonable defense of the good and decent people, not those invading monstrous hordes. This is again a long enduring human strategy for consolidation of power and consolidation of identity. All identity groups are artifices. We make them up. Racial groups are artifices, religious groups are artifices. Nations are made up things. They're not natural. They exist because we believe them to exist. And they exist because often the force of law and the violence that supports that maintain their existence. But they're not natural or, in a sense, true identities. They are constructs. And these constructs need constant maintenance. They need constant performing. We have to keep doing them. One of the things I discovered in the process of writing this book was, the idea of Christendom in the Middle Ages was not, at least in the early Middle Ages, not a place. It was an activity. And the suffix dome, there's a whole book written about the suffix dome. It's amazing. In Old English, the language Beowulf is written in. So Christendom is an Old English word, and it doesn't mean like the place where Christians rule or Christian land or something like that. It means the active practice of Christianness, which means that Christendom is people doing things, not a place, which means, of course, Christendom is exclusive of any non-Christians. And so the idea that, for example, Europe, which is often still in scholarship today referred to as Christendom, talking about the Middle Ages, if we refer to it as Christendom, well, that is part of why Jews weren't allowed to be English. Well, if England is part of Christendom, Jews inherently cannot participate in that. And so without conversion, which again, many Christian authors, exegetes believed was not technically possible because they weren't technically human. So yeah, the processes, I mean, you asked before, just studying medieval monsters might seem to people like a silly thing. It is, I trick my students into taking my classes by telling them that it'll be about monsters. And then one of my students said to me last semester, she said, I figured out what all of your classes are. All of your classes have the same pattern. They start off, wow, this is so fun, it's amazing. And then suddenly this is the most horrible thing I've ever heard. I thought about it, I thought, oh, you're right. This is not, a pattern I intentionally constructed. But yes, it seems like it's going to be fun and games. Oh, look, it's dragons. And then it turns out to be the history of racism and anti-Semitism and colonial violence and so on. But these things are intertwined. That is the work these images and stories do.
Wow. So viewing your body of work that way, what fun thing do you plan to ruin next? Where's your work going? What is on your horizon?
So the projects I'm very actively finishing, I'm nearly done. I'm working on image permissions. Now, a co-authored book that I'm writing with an Islamicist and a specialist in Chinese cartography, and that is on mapping in Jewish, Christian, Islamicate, and Chinese cultures during the Middle Ages and looking at the ways that they relate and differ and have similarities and so on, which has been a very interesting process. And then I'm also finishing up this revised second edition of my first book, which is almost 20 years old. Next year, it'll be 20. So I want to get that book finished so it can come out in its 20th year. And then after that, I am going to do something really fun, which is return to a project I did a lot of work on with my dear friend and longtime writing partner, Susan Kim, on this object called the Franks casket, which is an early English whalebone box. It's about the size of a cigar box. Nobody knows what a cigar box looks like anymore. It's about the size, it's a little bigger than a large tissue box, smaller than a toaster, but it has on it Old English, Latin, English runes, which are a script, Latin characters, stories from Jewish, Christian, Roman, Norse, and possibly Germanic myth, a riddle, and a code. So it is, I think, the most complicated object produced in human history. I haven't ever come across anything more complicated than it. And it is wonderful and deeply strange and doesn't make a ton of sense. And so Susan and I have been working on this for years and years, but we set aside the project while we were both working on other books for a while. And so we were going to return to that and finish our book on how that thing does what it's doing. And our goal, at least was, we haven't talked about this explicitly in a while, our plan was to try and write a whole book about it where we never say, quote unquote, what it means, but only talk about how it tricks us into constructing a wide range of meanings, which is what we do in the humanities, right? We look at complicated things, we look at paintings, we look at novels, poetry, whatever, and we construct all these meanings out of them. And this object is a good way of thinking through how actually do cultural documents make us do that. It has made a lot of very smart people make a lot of absolutely ridiculous arguments. And so we want to think about, like, what are the mechanisms? How does it manage to make us behave in certain ways, to cause us to think in certain patterns, rather than say, oh, and now the true secret meaning of it is, we found the Holy Grail or something in it, whatever. It was a box. It is a box. So, who knows what it had inside it? We have all kinds of theories, all of them definitely wrong. So anyway, that will be the next thing I turn to, and I am so excited about it, and it will be great fun. I mean, it does have on the back of it the Roman attack on Jerusalem when the Rome conquered the region and destroyed the temple and changed Judaism from that point forward. And it has, scenes of Jewish families being forced to flee this colonial violence from the Romans. So it's not all sunshine and rainbows, but it also has a weird figure sitting on a rock that has a kind of maybe horse's head and a tongue that maybe is a snake that seems to have three tongues coming out of it, or maybe fire, and wings. And it's sitting on a mountain talking to a person wearing weird robes. So there's a floating horse. There's Romulus and Remus, the mythical founders of Rome, with two wolves. Two? Who's the other one? We don't know. It's got Mary and Jesus, and it's got Wayland the Smith, who is a Norse sort of demigod character, magical wonder worker, and also horrible, violent rapist. But yes, it has all kinds of deeply strange and interesting and wondrous things on it. And so, yes, we're going to play around with that, hopefully for a good while. And then finally finish up we wrote about, I don't know, a third or two-thirds of a book on this years and years ago. So get to pick that up and play with that for a while.
That sounds fascinating. I am going to, watch for that project avidly. That sounds very interesting. I'm very interested in this casket that apparently depicts like both war crimes and like things that you might see on the, painted on the side of a van too. So it's very interesting.
Absolutely, yes. And honestly, the art on the side of many vans is a war crime.
That's true.
But yes, it is an absolutely fascinating thing. And it's also in its own way, deeply, deeply beautiful. One of the sort of highlights of my career, Susan and I went to the British Library and they took it out of the case and we were able to examine it in like a back office room for a day. And one piece of it, it was broken up in the 19th century under somewhat unclear circumstances. There's claims about it, but she and I think they may all be made up. But one part of it wound up in the Bargello, which is a museum in Florence that used to be a palace and then was a prison and is now a medieval art museum. And at the Bargello, they just handed the thing over to us and we got to handle this thing and play with it for a day. Very, 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 very gently in a completely airless, swelteringly hot room. And I was distracted the whole time by trying not to sweat on this panel of the Frank's casket. I didn't. But anyway, yes, getting to work with the most of it, which is in the British Museum in London, and this other one remaining piece that was in Florence, were absolutely extraordinary. I would love to come up with an excuse to go back and do it all again.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to our show and to tell us about your work. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm so glad that you virtually came to visit your hometown.
Well, thanks so much. I'm sorry if I prattled on quite a bit, but it's been a pleasure.
Oh, it's wonderful. So listeners, please check out Cartographies of Exclusion, Anti-Semitic Mapping in Medieval England, and the wider work of Dr. Asa Mittman. There's some really fascinating stuff on your website that is available to everybody. I'll throw a link in our show notes. And yeah, thank you for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.